Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. If this is your first time listening, you're definitely in for a treat. Here at Grief Refuge, we hold sacred space for your grief. It gets honored, and you're invited to explore the deeper understandings of your process and grief journey. With that said, you'll find Grief Refuge to be different from other grief-related podcasts. Instead of scratching the surface about grief, we go deeper, much deeper. Consider this podcast a personal PhD in your grieving process. I appreciate your listenership regardless of whether this is the first or the 45th time listening. I sincerely hope you feel more comforted, supported, and cared for as you navigate this difficult grief journey. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to stop multitasking while listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for self-care and reflection. Use this time to relax and allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. Use this time to mourn your loss. Thank you. Let's get started. There's a quote that says, "Grief can be the garden of compassion. If you keep your heart open through everything, your pain can become your greatest ally in your life's search for love and wisdom." Rumi. Today, I'd like to share with you a story from the Grief Refuge app. This is a story from my own personal experience. At the time of this recording, Father's Day is just a few days away, and I feel called to share my own personal story of how grief has shaped my life from a young age to the man I am now. Please enjoy Bound for Grief, a Fatherless Odyssey. "You finally did it, you son of a bitch." Those were the first words that came out of my mouth when I heard the news that my father had died. I had been prepping for that moment for a long time. My father was sick. He didn't have cancer or heart problems. He was an alcoholic and he had PTSD. What made it harder for me was that he knew he was sick. Yet it seemed like his efforts to get better were just plain old wimpy. He lived less than 2 miles from the VA hospital, and he spent a lot of time there. Ironically, he was so close to getting help, but he never really embraced what was available to him. Eventually, his suffering got the best of him and took his life. My youth was filled with confusion and self-blame for his issues. As a child, he often disappeared on my birthdays. I grew up believing I was insignificant and wasn't good enough to be celebrated. I grew up believing his suffering had to do with me. Fast forward into my teens and young adulthood, I found ways to better relate to my dad. We went out for dinner every few weeks or so. My dad wasn't easy to be around. He was a negative, defensive, and private person. At our dinners together, he vented and I listened. There were 3 things that he was the most comfortable talking about: the VA hospital and the lack of help it provided, the Minnesota Vikings and how they choked when it counted the most, and how his old high school buddy, Jesse Ventura, betrayed their friendship and his trust. My dad was the best complainer I had ever met. There was one thing that my dad didn't complain about, though. It was how proud of me he was. That was one of the few positive things that ever came out of his mouth. It meant the world to me when he would tell me that. He would also tell me that I could do anything I put my mind to. To this day, 14 plus years after his death, I still have a hard time believing that he would tell me that. I found it so ironic coming from him. He was someone who set his mind to his suffering. And then here he was saying I could do anything I put my mind to. Why didn't he ever put his mind to his healing or some form of positive outlook on life? Throughout his remaining years that he was alive, I witnessed many more of his alcoholic binges. I used to drive by his place during the middle of the day to find all the blinds closed, his car in the garage, the doors locked, and no sign of life in his house. In the back of my mind, I always wondered how long he could put himself through such misery. I figured he was destined to live a short life. Then on April 30th, 2006, I got that dreaded but not surprising voicemail from my brother. Reed, there's been a death in the family. Dad has died. When I got the voicemail, I was over 2,000 miles away. I was on the West Coast and I was in graduate school. The night before receiving that dreaded message, I had the most amazing date with my future wife. For me, life was going great. I was living my bliss. I was studying holistic psychology, and I was taking great care of myself. But then, just like that, my dad no longer existed. I remember the feeling quite well when I got the news. It hit me like a tidal wave. I felt a lot of shock and sadness at first. I was also confused. What was I supposed to do next? I was 28 years old and I no longer had a father. I debated whether to go to class that day. I chose to go, mostly because I didn't know what to do with myself if I were to stay home. I told my classmates about the news and they asked permission to perform a ceremony. I said yes, but in hindsight, I wished I would have declined. That brief ceremony was a foreshadowing for how I would initially respond to his death. A few days later, I went back to Minneapolis and I put on a smile. I told people I was happy that his suffering had ended. At the time, the way I was behaving was authentic. I truly believed his suffering was over, and for me, that invoked a feeling of relief. Initially, I felt joy and liberation in response to his death. Within 6 months of his passing, all of his possessions were either handed down, sold, or donated. His estate was finalized. My dad had become more of a memory than anything else. Since that time in 2006, my grief journey has also been an odyssey. I've made what seems like impossible efforts to get to know my dad more. I've read his journals several times. I've looked at his artwork several times. I've reached out to people who knew him and asked them to share their memories and stories. I've also made efforts to keep our relationship going, to somehow feel closer to him, although he's no longer here. One way I do this is, at the time that he died, I asked him to somehow embody a crow from time to time, to check in and say hello. I know this sounds esoteric or weird, but after 14 years of his death, I still find myself saying, "Hi, Dad," when I hear a crow caw. I then just watch the crow. I try to acknowledge what my energy is like when I'm in that moment. I ask myself, is there something there for me to hear? Am I being reminded of something? I guess it's a way of wondering if my dad's trying to tell me something. I remember many anniversary dates of his death. The first couple years I kept in touch with his significant other, Deb. We shared dozens of email messages. She would share how much she missed him and how kind he was to her. I would miss him in my own way, wondering how he could be emotionally available to his significant other, but unavailable to pretty much everyone else. For the first few years after his death, I was pretty angry with him. I still wanted him to be different. It was impossible, but I think I had the desire because I wanted to feel differently. I think I felt a little guilty for hanging on to the anger so much. I didn't express the anger in ways that most would recommend. Rather than writing or sharing it with a counselor, I hiked and I walked on the beach. In such environments, anger didn't feel as strong or intense. So it was easier for me to feel it and then let it go. 5 years after my dad died, I began to feel a change in my relationship with him. I began to forgive him. I forgave him for not being there when I wanted to feel special. I forgave him for quitting on his own life. I forgave him for not being available as a father to me. When I began to forgive, that change in our relationship became more real. I then began to feel compassion for him. And I began to see more of his efforts in trying to be a father in his own unique way. I saw more of how he tried in life. I realized that many of the things he did to show his love, I had taken those things for granted. For example, when I was in college, he found a way for me to get VA benefits to help pay for school. I remember thanking him for setting that up, but I didn't acknowledge it as a way that he showed his care and love for me, like I do now. Several years have now passed since his death, and I continue to discover new things about our relationship, now and before he died. This past April would have been his 70th birthday. My dad died when he was 56. The thought of hitting that 70-year milestone really hit me emotionally. So much has happened in the past 14 years. I felt sad that he had missed so much of my growing up and becoming a man. In this moment of reflection, I found myself repeating over and over again, in my own head, of how proud he was of me. That was really important to understand that I still needed to hear that. I also found myself imagining what his life would be like in his senior years. Would he have become more positive? Would he have found even more to complain about? What would he think of my wife? She's my everything in life. And what kind of relationship would they have had? I won't ever know the answer to those questions, and I have to be okay with that. Actually, I am okay with that. I just find myself continuing to be surprised by what kind of a father he was as I age and gain more life experience. Although I feel more compassion and forgiveness in our relationship now, there are still hard times. Some of my hardest moments are the times I reflect back on a relationship and wish I would have known more of who he was. My perception of him was the soldier who blamed the Vietnam War for his personal problems. that seemed so real in his experience. But was that all who he really was? To this day, I still ponder that question. I also have moments of guilt and find myself regretting the times I took for granted. When he told me some of his war stories, I wasn't aware of the amount of trust he had put into me. I don't blame myself because I was much younger then and unaware at the time. But I do wish I was able to be a bit more positively focused when I was in his presence. That's a lesson I've taken from our relationship, and I apply it to every other relationship in life, personally and professionally. When the grief waves hit and the longing for more in our relationship comes up, I rely on time alone in nature. I venture on a hiking trail and think about my dad. I take in the scenery around me and look for metaphors that represent our relationship. For example, 2 different trees rooted right next to each other is great symbolism for my dad and I. Both trees have unique features, but are rooted in the same system. And that's how I perceive me and him. 14 years after his death, I no longer judge my grief. Instead, I hold space for it. In addition to hiking and being in nature, I write and reflect more. Sometimes I write directly to my dad. Sometimes I write about a memory my mind is focused on at the time. Writing helps to reflect and let go of the emotions that weigh me down. It helps me feel better in the moment. Writing has become one of my greatest tools to help navigate the grief journey. It's a wonder how grief can stay with you for so long. Even though I truly feel reconciled with my father's death, I can still feel the sorrow hit me in the chest sometimes. Many say that grief will stay with you forever. The claim is that grief reminds you of how much love you had for the person you lost. I tend to resonate with that belief, but also think that the feeling state transforms. The intensity lessens if you allow the feelings to run their course. If you've ever been told that grief will change your life, I hope that my story helps you better understand how. Although it's been hard at times since my dad's passing, there are also moments of deeper understanding for his behaviors, more awareness of his love for me, and life wisdom gained from my fatherless Odyssey. Grief is a great teacher. There's a lot one can learn from it. As my fatherless Odyssey ventures on, I do my best to honor everything that comes up when I get hit by those grief waves that seem to come out of nowhere. What I know now is that the range of feelings have the ability to keep you on your heels. You may find it more comfortable to distract yourself, numb out the pain, or freeze up in grief. However, doing that is not sustainable in the long term. You'll eventually have to show up to your grief, give it space, learn from it, and feel through the emotions. It's sometimes a painful journey, but there are blessings. You will find a deeper connection to your soul, a heightened sense of compassion for others, and a wisdom to life that is uncanny. Grief teaches you how to grow. It deepens the connection to your heart and allows for more self-love. Grief can be the garden of compassion. If you keep your heart open through everything, your pain can become your greatest ally in your life's search for love and wisdom. Thank you so much for joining me and listening to a deeper sharing of my own personal grief journey. It's such an honor to help hold space for your grief and your healing. If you found this podcast episode to be helpful, please let us know by rating and reviewing the Grief Refuge podcast or sending us a message at griefrefuge.com. Before saying goodbye today, I want to remind you that today's story has been part of the many stories and musings on the Grief Refuge app. If you haven't downloaded it yet, it's just a quick search on the App Store for iPhone or Google Play Store for Android. The app is great. It was created with the intention and purpose to provide daily support on the grief journey. Here's a testimonial from Chantel, who is a recent app subscriber. She says, "The Grief Refuge app is a must-have if you have a broken heart. I've been exploring this app for a while now, and I have to say, I love it. If just for the simple reason that it calms my nervous system, and let's be real, my nervous system has been shot to shit thanks to grief. But beyond that, it's full of wisdom. I felt known, seen, and understood while listening to the recordings I've heard so far. And I love that it's audible because for me and my grief, my mental capacity had changed dramatically, and I just don't have the same drive I once did to read much, less the wherewithal to retain things that I do read. And my favorite of all the things, it's a safe space to honor my grief. There's no risk of misunderstandings and no chance of being harmed by bland platitudes. No defending and no wondering what others think about what I share about grief. No time commitments and no expectations of me. No pressure and no requirements to upkeep. And even better, it's in my reach whenever I need support, with no excuses for why it can't show up for me. It's an app that I'm so glad exists in the world. Do your grief a favor. Download the app now. You can thank me later. Better yet, thank Reed, the creator of Grief Refuge. Well, Chantel, I want to thank you tremendously for that very thoughtful testimonial. I am humbled, and yet I'm very happy to hear how much the app is helping you. So if your grief feels similar to Chantel's and you feel like you need more support, go download the Grief Refuge app now. Well, that's all for today. I have a lot of gratitude for your participation today. Thank you. Take care. Keep honoring your grief. Be kind to yourself and talk to you soon.